Hello, welcome to the George Macy Imagery video series. I've acquired 5 of the 6 Series 1 Limited Editions Club books that I was missing. So now I almost have the entire Series 1. The only book that I'm missing is the very first one, Gulliver's Travels. And that's because I didn't have an additional $150 to $200 to throw at that book on top of the other 5, which I got at varying costs. The most expensive one out of the new ones, I want to say, was probably Arthur Gordon Pym. I think that one was the most expensive out of these. Undine was a song. I got a really good deal on a really good version of that. And Rip Van Winkle as well, kind of the same deal. I got a really good price on that particular book. Baron Munchausen, you can see the spine's not particularly great on that, but that's okay. Robinson Crusoe is also a little banged up in terms of the spine and the outside binding, but it kind of works with that book a bit more than Munchausen does. But just sitting here and looking at all 11 of these books and just being so in awe of the fact that I'm this close to actually having my first full series, that's pretty cool. That's like a dream I've always had as a collector of these books, is to be able to lay claim to complete series. And at least with the first series, I don't have to deal with Henri Matisse or a Pablo Picasso signature making it hard to get a hold of them. So as you might have guessed, we're going back to the first series today. In terms of blog coverage, I've done Leaves of Grass, I've done Snowbound, and I've done the Decameron. And we've got Undine coming up later this year, but Undine is my favorite LEC ever, I think. So I think what I'm going to do today is we're going to just leave Leaves of Grass and Snowbound and the Decameron out of this video post. And I think what I'm going to do is focus on the remaining books that I did not cover last time, which will be the 5 new ones. So this will be a little bit of a longer video, but that's okay. So this is the Travels of Baron Munchausen, book number 3 out of the Limited Editions Club. This did get a reprint way in the future of 1952 as the 221st LEC, featuring pen and watercolor drawings by Fritz Cradle, who would make his debut in Series 2. So we won't see him in any of the books for today. This particular Munchausen was illustrated with linoleum cuts by John Held Jr. And Macy has some comments on this particular edition, and I don't think that he had very high opinions of Mr. Held. This was a stunt to turn America's best-known comic genius loose on Munchausen, and I think now that the stunt would have been more successful if the comic genius had taken his assignment more seriously. The best things about this book are, I think, Paul McFerrin's stroke of genius in making his drawings of great big fishes for the binding, and Carl Van Doren's stroke of genius in making his fine introduction a coruscating essay on lying. So Macy did not hold the illustrations in much regard, but we can spotlight the fish a little bit. Unfortunately, my spine is very, 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 very worn. But honestly, that's the biggest issue with the book, other than the binding being a little bit banged up. But this is one of the more expensive Series 1 books. This particular one didn't run me too much. I got it at a pretty good deal, but I also knew I was getting a less than perfect copy, which I was okay with. So let's go ahead and open it up, and then I'll read you the production details while we hang out on the title page. And we can get an idea of John Held's artistry here, if it will cooperate. There we go. Alright, so The Travels of Baron Munchausen was introduced, like Macy noted, by Carl Van Doren, with linoleum cuts by John Held Jr., designed by William A. Kittredge, printed and bound by the Lakeside Press, Chicago, set in a monotype Baskerville, worthy signature special paper on half-green calfskin, gold-stamped printed cloth sides, 238 pages, 7 1/4 by 10 1/4 inches. This particular book has seen some action. You'll notice that if I turn the page here, that it has stained through. So whoever had this book before me did not take the world's greatest care of it. But again, I knew what I was getting into when I bought it, so I am not horrifically disappointed. And other than that, the interior is pretty good. So let's go ahead and find some examples of the illustrations. Some of the pages in this one have not been cut yet, so that's kind of always an exciting thing. But here's an example of the font, or the text, and one of the linoleum cuts. Quite the contrast to the later Fritz Cradle illustrations. And then here's a different one. Most of the illustrations are of that yellow block variety, but there's a few that are internal like this. Alright, and then here is a final example. Some of the illustrations towards the back half of this book get into insensitive racist territory, so we'll skip looking at those. But here is the colophon. Here you can see that John signed, and this is number 995 of 1,500 copies. All right, so let's get into one that I am particularly pleased with, and that is this lovely edition of The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe. This is book number 5, and Poe would have a few more run-ins with the Limited Editions Club. A collection of his tales of mystery and imagination would come out later, with William Sharp handling the illustrations. A book of his poems would also be done by the LEC as part of the American Poets series that they did. It all had kind of thematic, similar bindings. I have the Emerson in that set, but none of the others yet. And that was illustrated by Hugo Steiner Prague. And I want to say off the top of my head that that was all that was done with Poe. This particular book has a lovely slipcase, the nicest one in my opinion, at least of all the ones I've acquired slipcases with. The binding is just this very, very, very black material, and it really kind of just catches your eye. So Macy has some comments on here. So he says, I was and am harried by the conviction that there was and is more art in the advertising spaces of America's magazines than in the pages of America's illustrated books. That is why I have several times approached the practitioners of advertising art to ask them to bend their talents to the illustration of our books. Renee Clark, who is now the president of one of our best advertising agencies, was then its art director and a practicing artist. His pictures for this book bear me out, I think, in their splendid drawing and fiercely imaginative quality. I think he let me down later with Faust. Well, we are not covering Faust today. We are covering the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, so we will we'll come back to that comment at a later date. But this has, like, the font choice here really reminds me of like newspaper font, or it reminds me of the 1800s, and I think it was an inspired choice to go with the font that they chose. This was introduced by Joseph Wood Crunch with line drawings by Renee Clark, designed by Fred Anthoinsen, printed by the Southworth Press, Poland, Maine, set in lithotype Scotch Roman, Worthy Aurelian special paper, bound by George McKibben & Son, New York, in half charling vellum, printed in black leather sides, 288 pages, 7.5 by 11 inches. So Clark has really dynamic line drawings that are printed in very strong blacks. So here's an example of the font here. And there's my cat Finn. So the illustrations vary in size. So I think this is one of the first ones in the book here. So we'll get a little bit closer. There we go. Here's another one. They're really striking. Here's one more. And there's a few of the major characters in the text as well. But I think Clark did a really good job capturing this book. I really like the illustrations in it. They're not, I would say, my favorite, but they are very striking. And I think they are very effective. So, of this edition, there's 1,500 copies, and this one here is number 735, and Clark provides his signature. Out of all the LECs I picked up, out of these 5, this is arguably the nicest of them all in terms of the book itself and this having a complete slipcase. This particular book is difficult to find in good condition because of the leather. I took a risk on this one, and it's not perfect, it's not ideal, but the spine is the really tricky part when it comes to Rip Van Winkle in the secondhand market. And a lot of the spines are just completely destroyed. And this one does have some fraying going on at the top and the bottom, as well as a little stain there at the bottom. And a little bit of wear to the rest of it. But honestly, like, I was seeing this particular book being sold for way more than what this particular seller was selling it for, in far worse condition than this in terms of the spine. So I went ahead and took a gamble on it, and I'm very pleased that I did, because I think this is the nicest Rip Van Winkle that I saw out of the options I had available, and it was the cheapest, so go me. Macy didn't have any comments on this one, so we'll just go ahead and get right into it. This is a pretty nice book, but it's also, it reminds me a lot of like how novels were printed in like the late 1800s based on what I've seen. So they, again, did a really good job with that. This is introduced by Mark Van Doren with line reproductions of steel engravings by F.O.C. Darley from 1848, printed in brown. This was designed by Frederick W. Gowdy, printed by the Walpole Printing Office in New Rochelle, New York. It was hand-set by Bertha M. Gowdy and Catskill type, made especially for this book by Mr. Gowdy. Worthy Hadrian special paper bound by George McKibben and Son, New York, in full green sheepskin with gold stamped, 62 pages, 6.5 by 9 and 13/16 inches. This was, to the best of Macy's ability, printed where Washington Irving wrote about it. So it takes place in the same, it was printed in the same place as it takes place, which is pretty cool. And Catskill was a font specifically designed for this book to invoke that era, in that area, the era of that area, we'll say. So the illustrations are reproduced. They are not new to this edition, but they look really nice. So here's an example of how the font looks, as well as a nice little decoration on the top there. And then there's a lot of these really nice reproductions of these illustrations, and they are printed extremely well. And there's quite a few of them in here. Unfortunately, they're all kind of at the top and are very detailed but very small. So I'm trying to get the camera to pick them up adequately. Irving had an interesting career with the George Macy Company because his major works, which would be Diedrich Knickerbocker's sketchbook, where Rip Van Winkle is from, wasn't actually printed by the LEC at all. It was printed by the Heritage Press. I'm going to sit on the colophon for a minute. As well as Jeffrey Cran's sketchbook was also a Heritage exclusive. It would be a bit before Irving would come back to the pages of the LEC, and it wasn't during Macy's time period, it was afterwards. My memory is the Alhambra was, I think, in the 60s, and there may be one other one that was done in the 60s as well, but he's one of those odd curios, Washington Irving, in terms of how the LEC handled his work, much like the Bronte sisters, who didn't have a LEC until 1991 or 92 with Sid Shrift, but did have heritage editions of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. So this is copy number 177 of 1500 and is signed by the printer F.W. Gowdy. Here is, in my opinion, out of the ones I've seen, there's only one I haven't seen, the shining jewel of the first series. And Macy does not share my opinion, but we'll get to that in a minute. This is Undine by F. de la Monte Fouque. I'm probably saying that incorrectly, as I tend to do when I get into languages that are not English, so I apologize if I butchered that name. But let's get this out of the slipcase, because the slipcase is fine. but it's definitely taken some toll over the years. But let's look at this incredible binding. This is easily among my favorite bindings in the entire LEC. It is easily my favorite binding in the first series. It is gorgeous. And I'm going to go ahead and scoot it up just a little bit so you can be appreciated a bit more. Just incredible, incredible looking. So let's get into Macy's comments. The full-page illustrations which Mr. Lewis made for this book are altogether superb. The full-page decorations which he made now seem to me to have little pleasure in them. I learned from the association with Mr. Lewis in the creation of this book how great a contribution to the excellence of a book its publisher can make, by helping the illustrator to realize his intention. Mr. Lewis conceived the idea of a series of small decorations which, put together in various combinations, would create large-scale decorations to surround the pages of type. The idea was splendid, but if I had more nerve in 1929, I would have told Mr. Lewis that the various units were pleasant enough singly, but when grouped together were meaningless and lacked prettiness. I think that I have, on dozens of occasions since, helped the artist engaged in the illustration of one of our books to see that he was taking himself up the wrong path. A surgeon is often critical of his own work. A bricklayer is usually critical of his own work, but I know few artists who are capable of criticism of their own work. The making of this criticism is a prime function of the publisher to an illustrated book, but how hard it is to make the criticism and remain friends with the artist. Now, I see what Macy's getting at, but honestly, the interior of this book is beautiful. I love all of it. I have no complaints about it whatsoever. But Macy has a different opinion, and we'll see if you agree with me that this is one of the most beautiful LECs ever made, or if you agree with Macy, who thinks that the decorations lack meaningless and lack prettiness. So here is the lovely title page. So here is production details. This was translated by Edmund Goss, who also did the introduction. I will add that in. Designed and illustrated with color woodcuts by Alan Lewis, printed by the Harbor Press, New York, set in linotype cloister, with headlines drawn by Mr. Lewis, worthy Aurelian special paper, bound by George McKibben in Sun, New York, in full sienna linen, printed and gold stamped, 152 pages, 9.5 by 12.5 inches. The use of color is very effective, in my opinion, for this book, because it has this lovely blue and this lovely brown, and it works really well with the black type and the white ink to just, in fact, it could, since this is a wood cut, they might not even have printed anything there. It might just be the paper. So all around each page of this book are these nice little borders that Macy was talking about, where they're pieces of various illustrations put together. And I like them, but I can understand what he's saying by the fact that they don't come together, because they are, as noted, random. But they have, this is just such a lovely book. I love this book. Every time I look at it, like this is my jam, is this type of stuff. But you can see, like, each page kind of does something just a little bit different. And to me, I don't mind. I don't think it looks meaningless, but I can understand the argument. But let me find a couple of the larger illustrations, which I will admit can be a bit tricky to find since every page is illustrated like this. So here is a little bit of a closer up view of this, and just the blue's not really standing out. I'll see if I can edit that in post to make it look a little bit more like the blue ink that it actually is. But Lewis did an incredible job on the woodcuts in this book. And if you've listened to me or read the blog enough, you'll know how much I adore woodcut illustrations. And these, in my opinion, are some of the finest the LEC ever printed and reproduced. And I think that the ink choice was a big reason why. The blue ink really just makes them pop. I'll have to see if Lewis did anything else while we're looking at the colophon for a minute. So there is the colophon, and this is number 1026 out of 1500, and Lewis's signature is on the other side. This is one of the more decadent colophons. And Lewis, he did another one. He did 120 as well. So 120 is Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. So I'll have to look into that one because I really like his work in Undine, and would be interested in seeing what else he's done. But yes, this is without a doubt my favorite LEC of the first series, and is in contention for one of my favorites of all time. Robinson Crusoe. This one is one of the more fascinating books in the entire LEC canon because of who printed it and the resulting fallout between the printer and Macy that led to no further contributions from this particular publisher. So this particular book is notable for that alone, and it's notable because in terms of me, I live in California. I have been around collecting these books for a long time and worked at a museum that did a lot of stuff related to California history. So the Grabhorn Press was a press that I had seen a lot in that museum, and I've seen their editions while looking at other books. They do good work. I wouldn't say that they're like the top tier printer in the world, but they did good work. They were well known, and Macy turned to them for Robinson Crusoe. But I'll let him tell the tale. When the Limited Editions Club sent out its first announcement, there was violent opposition from some quarters. One printer, because of the extent of his influence at that time, actively sought to do his best to prevent me from carrying through the plans of the club. One action he took was to attempt to dissuade Edwin Grabhorn from proceeding with his contract with me to print this book. In the light of a mellowing perspective, I believe the printer honestly thought me incapable of carrying through the club's plans and considered it his duty to the graphic arts to prevent my colleagues and me from wrecking the institution of the book. And I believe that I might have found Edwin Grabhorn more amicable and more reliable if this dissuasive influence had not been exercised upon him. At any rate, this book is one of the most beautiful that we have published, because Edwin Grabhorn, while not the best of American printers, is certainly among the most inventive of American designers of books. Yet the business altercations which surrounded the production and completion of this book were such that the club has never had another book from the Grabhorn printery. And this continued after his death, to my understanding. And there was never another Grabhorn publication. So this is a unique book, and if you are familiar with Grabhorn, the spine, which mine is beaten and sunned and doesn't look great, it's a Grabhorn spine. This is a very soft, pliable binding, and it really reminds me of like a sailor's journal, which is very appropriate for what Robinson Crusoe represents. This title page is a little bit spicy because Grabhorn kind of grabbed a lot of Edward A. Wilson's art and just kind of chopped it up and put it back together in a way, in a coloring scheme that just didn't really work well with the artist or with Macy, from my understanding, because when the Heritage Press reprinted this book, this was redone and recolored, so it looks like it's a little bit more of a cohesive whole than separate parts. Alright, production details. So this was introduced by Ford Maddox Ford. Line illustrations in color by Edward A. Wilson, the very first book he worked on. And he had quite the career, which I'll go over after I'm done with this particular one. Designed, printed, and bound by Edwin Grabhorn at the Grabhorn Press, San Francisco. Set in monotype Centaur with Letitia italic and Gaudi text. Panacoec paper on flexible green Venetian sailcloth, gold stamped red leather label, 404 pages, 7 by 10.5 inches. Wilson, as I was saying, had a long career. He was doing stuff all the way through the 60s. So he was definitely one of the stalwarts for the George Macy Company and beyond. And this is a good example of his stuff once we maybe move past this title page. But you can kind of see here that there's really nice like little decorations in here. This is a Grabhorn book, I tell you what, because I'm so familiar with their publications. It really is a Grabhorn book. So here's an example of one of the illustrations on the inside. So there was interior ones like this, and I believe that there are full page ones as well. So it looks like I'm wrong, but we'll go ahead and just use this one as our last example there. Wilson does good work, although I would say that this is probably not his best work. I think that would come a little bit later. And then the colophon page, which is super fancy. This is number 96 of 1,500 copies and is signed by Edward A. Wilson. And just for interest's sake, they kept up this list of publications all the way through all 12 books. La Fontaine also has it and is the last one. But I am very pleased with this book. Despite a little bit of wear to the outside, the inside's pretty solid. There's a couple little specks here and there, but it's just so nice to have a book that reminds me of my museum time. Wilson had 17 commissions in total, which is quite the run, if I did my math correctly. So for the Heritage Press, he did 2 exclusives. He did A Shropshire Lad by A.E. Housman in 1935, as well as The Book of Edward A. Wilson, A Survey of His Work, which was issued in 1948 with a box of sample illustrations, if my brain is accurate. And then let's go ahead and get into his LECs. So following Robinson Crusoe, The Last of the Mohicans in 1932, Green Mansions in 1935, The Man Without a Country in 1936. Here's Finn. I was mentioned him earlier. I don't know if he's actually going to end up in this video, but he keeps walking into it. So, Anthony Adverse in 1937. He did The Tempest in the LEC Shakespeare. Treasure Island in 1941. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner in 1945. Westward Ho in 1947. The Seven Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor in 1949. Ivanhoe, a second run of Ivanhoe, done in 1951. Then A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1952. This is one of the rare examples of an illustrator being featured in the same series twice in the 20th series. Then he got on a bit of a Verne kick, Jules Verne that is. He did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1956, The Mysterious Island in 1959. He took a little break from Verne to illustrate The Deerslayer in 1961, then came back to Verne for Around the World in 80 Days in 1962. And A Journey to the Center of the Earth in 1966 is his last LEC commission, and he passed away in 1970. So, quite the career. I think my favorite LEC that I have seen of his so far is The Tempest, which I'm sure we will cover the LEC Shakespeare on this video series in time, but there is a post on that one, so you can check it out in advance. I hope that you enjoyed checking out the rest of the series. Like I said, I don't know if I'm going to immediately cover the books that are already on the blog, which would be the Decameron, Snowbound, and Leaves of Grass, unless there's an interest for me to do a video on those. I'm kind of looking at the video series as a way to elaborate on stuff I haven't written about yet, as well as get into more personal stories. And while in this case I wanted to share all of the new LECs that I got for April, I think that we'll probably do something drastically different for May. So I don't know what exactly that's going to be. I think it'll probably be a spotlight on a book that I happen to like a lot. So we shall see what I decide. But until then, have a wonderful, wonderful month, and take care.